Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and I work here at the Compost Education Centre. Today, we've teamed up with the Greater Victoria Public Library to bring you this video all about composting. We're going to learn what compost is, how we can make compost, and why compost is so important. This video is coming out over spring break, which is the perfect time to learn about making compost. So what is compost? I have some compost here, and it looks sort of just like regular old dirt. But compost is a really special kind of dirt that's made when the waste that living things produce is recycled. Just like we put other things like this aluminum can into our recycling bin, and we recycle that aluminum to make a new can, we can put plants into a compost bin and recycle them to grow new plants. So let's talk about waste. All living things produce waste. Waste could be the dead leaves that fall from a tree, the pieces of eggshell left over after a baby bird is born, or waste could be the nutshells that a squirrel throws away, or the flakes of skin and hair that fall off of animals. We might not think of all of these things as waste, but they are. The waste that comes from living things is called organic waste. The reason we don't see organic waste piling up all around us all the time is because organic waste decomposes. Decomposing means that it's broken up into smaller and smaller pieces by tiny living things called decomposers. We'll talk about decomposers a little bit later. So here I have some fruit and vegetable scraps from my lunch. And these are all types of organic waste since they came from living things, plants. So I've got some orange peel here, I've got some carrot peels, some banana peel, a little bit of kale that went kind of bad before I could eat it, even some weeds that I picked from out front of my yard. These are all types of organic waste. And you might think that when I'm done with these organic wastes, my banana peels and my apple cores, I might just throw them in the garbage. But I wouldn't want to just throw them in the garbage, because if I did that, then these organic wastes wouldn't be able to help me grow more plants or feed the living things around us. So what can I do instead of throwing them in the garbage? I can put them in a compost bin just like this. Inside this compost bin, there's an entire community of decomposers that are all working super hard to decompose the dead material, like these scraps, into compost. Some of the decomposers in this bin might be fungi, worms, insects like pill bugs, and other living things that are so small that they're only made up of one tiny cell. Some living things like bacteria are so small, there's no way you can see them with just your eyes. You'd actually need a microscope to see them, kind of like this. And later, I'm going to set up this microscope so we can take a look at some of the living things that are inside of our compost. So, if we take our organic wastes and we feed them to the decomposers that live inside this bin, in a few months or maybe a year, they'll have turned all of that waste into beautiful compost. I'm going to open this up, and inside the bottom, there's this beautiful compost. It's nice and rich and crumbly. And the thing that's great about compost is that it's full of nutrients. So nutrients are what living things need in order to grow and stay healthy. We humans get our nutrients from the foods that we eat. Plants get their nutrients from the soil. They absorb nutrients all through their roots. So when we add compost to the soil, there's a little plant over here. I'm going to feed it some compost. The compost is like its food, and it's full of nutrients for the plant. And the plant is going to absorb all those nutrients, and it's going to help it become big and healthy. So normally the nutrients that are in organic wastes, they're all sort of locked up inside the waste. But when we put it in a bin and decomposers get to it, the decomposers sort of unlock the nutrients in the waste and let the plants absorb it. So basically, compost is a plant's favorite food. And just like some of our favorite foods, compost has a recipe. And even though there's a lot of different ways to make compost, usually they all follow the same basic recipe. And the recipe is pretty easy to remember because it's just two types of ingredients, browns and greens. So I'll show you some browns first. Browns are easy to remember because they're usually kind of brown or dull in color, like this tree bark or this straw, which is basically dry grass. There's these brown dead leaves. Those are part of the browns family. And there's also these twigs. So these things, we call them browns because they're often brown. They aren't always, but they usually are. And they're really helpful because, well, first of all, the decomposers love to eat browns. But secondly, you'll notice that the browns are all kind of dry and crackly and crinkly. Well, inside of all these crackly parts, you can see that there's spaces for air. If I hold up some of this straw and these twigs, it's not all solid. There's little holes in it where air can get in and out. And air is really, really important in compost because all of the decomposers that live in this bin, they need to breathe air just like we do. And I don't know if you can see it, but on this bin, there's little holes all the way around, and that helps the air get in and out. So that's the browns family. The greens family is basically like what I showed you before. Greens family are usually wet and kind of squishy, so this banana peel is definitely in the greens family. This kale, these orange peels, they're not all green in color, but they're usually more colorful in the browns family, which helps you kind of remember. And the greens family, because they have so much water in them, that's also really important because decomposers, just like us, need water to live. So now that we have our ingredients, I can add them into this bin. So we know the recipe is browns and greens. I'm just gonna throw my browns in, and then I'm gonna take my greens and I'm gonna throw those on top. And when we make compost this way, we're always layering browns, greens, browns, greens, browns, greens, over and over to make the layers all the way to the top. And when we make layers like that, it makes sure that all of the decomposers can get to all the different delicious parts that they want. They're not just stuck in one layer. Another thing we can add to our compost is newspaper. Can you guess which family the newspaper is in? Do you think it's in the browns family or the greens family? It's in the browns family. It's kind of brown in color, it's crinkly, and it's actually made of wood. All paper is made of wood, and wood is a plant. It comes from trees, so it's also organic waste. And even the ink that we print on our newspaper, in Canada at least, is made with plants, so it's totally safe to go in our compost. I'm just gonna rip some up. I wanna make it a little bit smaller so that all of our decomposers can get to it. And I'm just gonna put that on top of the greens. So now I have a layer of the browns, there's some greens, and then I just put more browns back on top. And every time I add to this bin, I'm gonna add another layer. And they're just gonna keep layering up. And I can also add a little bit of air to this compost by mixing it just a little bit, fluffing it up with a garden fork or even a stick. So now we've got our layers of organic waste. This is where the decomposers will come in and do their thing. The browns and greens are the decomposers' food. Basically, the decomposers eat our waste. The decomposers that break down these wastes need to eat a balance of browns and greens in order to make the best compost. So when we add things to our compost bin, we're creating layers and making sure that we have about the same amount of browns and greens. Maybe a little bit more browns than greens, but as long as you have both, it'll be okay. It's also a good idea to add a variety of different ingredients to our compost, because just like us, decomposers that live in here benefit from eating a variety of foods. And then after maybe 6 months or a year, once the decomposers have had enough time to eat the browns and greens and break them down into smaller and smaller pieces, our compost is finished, just like I showed you earlier. Since we layered everything from the bottom up, that means the stuff at the bottom is the oldest. This has been in here for about a year, so it's fully broken down. The layers on the top, they'll need more time. And when it's ready, it should look crumbly and dry, and it smells pretty good too. It kind of smells like a forest. It smells nice and earthy. You might think that it would smell really bad since it's made of old food and things like that, but it actually smells really nice. And that's because the decomposers that make bad smells don't like to live where there's lots of air. And there's lots of air in this compost because of the air gaps and all those crinkly ingredients that we showed you, and also the air holes that are in the compost. So now that we have some finished compost, we can spread it around and use it to grow all kinds of plants. And we could also even give it to our friends or our family to help them grow plants if we don't have a garden ourselves. So outdoor bins like this are a great way to make compost. But there's also a way you can make compost pretty easily, right inside your home or your school. You can make it in a bin just like this one, with the help of some really helpful animal friends. So I have one of my animal friends here with me, and their name is Dr. Wriggles. And Dr. Wriggles is a very special type of worm called a red wriggler. And Dr. Wriggles, I like to bring Dr. Wriggles out because they're a lot bigger than a regular worm, so they help us kind of see all the parts of the worm a little bit better. So there's a couple things about worms that make them the really, really best companions for making compost. First of all, worms don't have eyes, do they? You've probably never seen a worm with giant eyes. They also don't have ears, they don't have a nose, they don't have eyebrows or hair, they don't have any of that. All they have is just one big mouth. So you can imagine how silly your face would look if it was just a giant mouth. But it's actually a really good thing that worms just have a big mouth, because it means they can eat a lot. So if I made a pile of food that was the same size as this worm's body, it could eat through all of that food in a single day. So I don't think I could eat that much food in one day. I'd probably explode. That's a lot of food. But you can imagine that if I put food in this bin for this worm, and it's the same food that went in here, our browns and our greens, the worm could eat it really fast and make lots and lots of compost in an even faster amount of time than what we would get out of that bin. They can make compost in about 3 or 4 months. So I'll talk a little bit more about how worms eat. Worms have a really special area right around here called their gizzard. Gizzard's kind of a silly word, but it's a really important part of the worm. Because you'll notice next time you pick up a worm and look at one, they don't have any teeth. So you might wonder, how do they get their food to be nice and small, like we chew our food up, in order for them to be able to swallow it? Well, what worms do is they wriggle around and they find bits of rocks or sand or even shells or eggshells, and they eat them and they store all those sharp, hard things in their gizzard. And then when they go and they eat their food, the gizzard sort of grinds up all their food with the rocks and the sharp, hard things that are in there. It grinds up all the food into something kind of almost like a smoothie so that it can travel all the way down the worm a lot easier. And then out of the tail end of the worm comes our compost. And that's how we make compost, or more specifically, it's how the worms make compost in a bin just like this. So there's another part of the worm that might be standing out to you right now. Part of the worm that is kind of bigger. Right here, we call this the clitellum. And only adult worms have a clitellum. So if you see a worm on the ground and it has a band on it that's a little bit thicker and a different color than the rest of the worm, that's an adult worm. And worms use their clitellum in order to lay their eggs. So when this adult worm is ready to lay some eggs, it's had a nice big meal and it's ready to lay its eggs on the ground, it'll actually lie down like this and it'll wriggle backwards out of the clitellum. And it'll actually just leave the clitellum on the ground. And inside the clitellum are a bunch of worm eggs. So that's how worms make their eggs, and they can make a lot of eggs really, really fast. If you started a worm bin like this one with about 100 worms, you'd have thousands and thousands of worms within just a few months. All right, so now that we know a little bit about worms, let's take a look at some actual worms that we have right inside at the Compost Education Centre. So here you can see some worms wriggling around in one of our compost bins. Worm bins like this are a great spring break project to do with your family. If you're interested in setting up a worm bin, you can get an adult to help you visit the Compost Education Centre website at compost.bc.ca, where we have a free fact sheet all about worm bins. or feel free to give us a call or stop by our office here in Fernwood for tips on taking care of worms. We love helping people learn how to compost with worms, since they don't take up a lot of space and can be kept right inside your home. If you take good care of them, the bin won't even smell bad. I have a worm bin in my bathroom cupboard at home, and lots of people have worm bins under their sinks or in their closets. They can even live outside on a balcony for most of the year. The Greater Victoria Public Library also has lots of books you can borrow that show you how to set up a worm bin, how to take care of your worms, and even how to harvest your compost when it's done. So, we've learned how to reuse our organic waste and met some friends that help us make compost. So what if we didn't compost our organic waste? Well, it would all get thrown into the garbage, where it would be taken on trucks to a place called a landfill. A landfill is where garbage gets piled up and up and up, but it doesn't recycle the nutrients that we talked about earlier. Remember when we learned that air and water are important for decomposers? Landfills don't get enough air and water for the decomposers to do their thing, so the waste doesn't become compost. Any nutrients that are in our waste that get sent to the landfill pretty much just stay there, and they don't help new things grow. So why should we make compost? Making compost is a great way to recycle organic waste. As long as there have been living things making waste, there have been communities of decomposers helping to recycle it, which helps more living things grow, and those living things make more waste, which helps more decomposers, and the cycle continues. This is part of what's called the nutrient cycle. If I grow some plants, maybe I grow some vegetables like carrots in this garden bed here with this compost, I can take the tops of the carrots, the green part that I don't eat, and put it back into this compost bin. Then I'll get compost out of the bottom that I can use to grow more carrots or whatever I want. The nutrient cycle is really important because it keeps the soil healthy. We talked about how our food is full of nutrients that help us grow, but even the leftover parts that we don't want to eat can become food for decomposers. Returning nutrients to the soil keeps the soil healthy. Healthy soil means healthy plants, which means the animals that eat those plants, including us, will be healthier too. You may also have a green bin that looks kind of like this, but a lot bigger, where you put your organic waste. This is a lot better than throwing your food scraps into the garbage, because the stuff in our green bin gets taken to a place where compost is made. It's kind of like a big compost factory. But sometimes these places are really far away from where we live, so we have to use trucks and boats to send our waste there. That uses a lot of energy. And we also don't actually get any compost out of it a lot of the time to grow our own food in our own communities. So one of the best things we can do with our organic waste is to make compost ourselves if we can, because it saves energy and also produces compost that we can use ourselves or give to our friends and neighbors. Even if you don't have a space to make compost in, talk to your neighbors and friends to see if any of them do. Or you could ask your school if they could set up a compost bin like this one. Composting takes care of the soil, which helps take care of all the living things around us. And when we do that, we're also taking care of ourselves and each other. Well, that's about it from me today. I hope that you learned something about compost and maybe even feel like you'd want to start making compost yourself. Before we go, I think I'm going to get my microscope out and I'm going to take a look at some decomposers that are living in my compost. I took a little bit of compost and some water and put it on a slide under this microscope, and we're going to take a look and see them up close. Let's check it out, and happy composting.